happy to talk about both of them, but is there one of them that folks are more excited about? You can do thumbs down if there's none of them, like if you don't care either way, and you can hold a 1 up for the first one where it's about what's happened in the past, and a 2 for like talking about fundraising and stuff.
So is 1 like the sort of a better understanding of the financial solidarity that has happened and like how things ran? Okay, yeah, 1. Thank you.
Cool. Okay, then that's what I'm gonna put a little bit more time into. And I did some like collecting of data to the extent that I was able to. So there's some cool stuff. Great. I will share my screen. Oh, first I'm gonna present. And then I'm gonna share my screen. I got this. Share. Hooray. I think that worked. Cool. So a little bit of origins to the financial solidarity section of mutual aid. Like the rest of mutual aid, it was sort of came about from a combination of folks knowing each other, folks being interested, and it started as just the Google spreadsheet, which I'll show you guys in a sec. But the original folks there was a group of folks who we're thinking of our members or connected to or previous members of a group called Resource Generation, which is a national group focused on folks with inherited wealth or wealth from their jobs, redistributing it and challenging capitalism and meritocracy and all of the things that and silencing and all of the things that come along with wealth. And so a group of us have talked a couple of times before COVID started, I think starting in October maybe of last year. Someone should refute that if I'm incorrect. And so that group came together around the spreadsheet, and then Julia, as the connection point, brought in a lot of folks from Solidarity Economy, and then sort of everyone reached their tendrils out and brought folks in. So that was the original group of folks that started on the financial solidarity subgroup. And then just like everything else, it was open to whoever was interested. But it was started with an inherent critique of capitalism and recognizing, just as was true of the rest of mutual aid, that things were not okay before COVID, things would likely not be okay during or after COVID, and we should coordinate and collaborate as best we can now to help as many people as we can, or to support the network of folks that help and support folks. So the first one was just the Google spreadsheet. As you can see above, the blue one was the first one. It was based off of a couple different mutual aid spreadsheets that a collection of colleges and cities across the country, Oakland in particular, we used for a lot of our guidelines and structures. Then it expanded into the white one that is on the bottom, which sort of is built up a bit more and has more options and has more information and was translated. And then I think at the end of March, we transitioned from this to Airtable and the website and how everything sort of works today. Quickly, one of the mainstay goals of the financial solidarity team and any conversations about money that we participated in or were a part of, we're focusing on financial solidarity rather than charity. This might be a framework that folks have been exposed to, so I'm going to go over it a little bit quickly and then open up for questions a little bit later. But essentially, charity, the nonprofit or Judeo-Christian model sort of says there's a hierarchy, there are the folks with wealth, access, power, etc., and out of the like grace of their hearts and the kindness of their souls, they deign give certain things to folks who might not have that access, privilege, wealth, etc. But they decide how it's spent, they exert a decent amount of control over it, it's bureaucratic, and this process is sometimes seen as more important than the outcomes for the people who receive the support. The counter to that we were really trying to invest in and expand into was financial solidarity. So one-on-one giving, recognizing that folks are not, these sort of hierarchies, one, don't exist, and to the extent that they exist, it's based on the structures of oppression, racialized capitalism, heteropatriarchy, etc. And so there is not a merit inherent to the wealthy folks or the folks with access that is not true of the folks who don't have access or don't have series of wealth. People know best what they need. There's nothing that people who have money know more about other people's lives just because they have money, or that also doesn't confer expertise necessarily. Building relationships is one of the ways to level this hierarchy, to recognize that everyone can have something to give and something to receive, and not everybody has to give. People can just receive, people can, but being a part of this network also involved relationships and community, and it was a faster transfer of money and power and responsive to the folks who were receiving support. But, we're interacting with capitalism, and we're interacting with a lot of these structures. So one thing that was also super important to us was to be aware of white supremacy culture in this. And I listed off some of the instances of white supremacy culture that we either confronted or were conscientious to avoid or worked really hard to, and still probably have some work to do about. So this is sort of how this group raised, or one of the explanations of how this group raised the money that we did. And the next slide, I get to tell like the exciting thing that a lot of y'all already know about how much we've actually raised so far, which is sort of incredible. But the process was mostly that the group that started it reached out to our personal networks, right? So like my mother, for example, is a reoccurring donor because I asked her and convinced her, and now she's a reoccurring donor. She doesn't live in St. Louis. She's never stepped foot in the state of Missouri, but because of the relationship, it is something she cares about because it's something that I care about. And that was a lot of where we started. We sort of created lists of who we thought would be interested or engaged or connected or part of this community, and then reached out to them personally. There were a couple different methods. Once we had exhausted all the people we could think of, we then asked the people we had brought in to bring in more people. From there, we then went to the things on the outside. So Instagram, we haven't actually posted anything on Instagram, but other people posted things on Instagram saying donate to mutual aid, join mutual aid, become a member. One of my friends had a dance-a-thon where people committed a certain amount of money for every 15 minutes that she danced, and she danced for 3 hours. And so we got like, I think $3,000. Some people started up individual email newsletters, and then we had one larger scale email newsletter that went to all people who had supported mutual aid. We held 2 webinars, some outside groups. So y'all will notice, or y'all know that I think we got a total of $50,000 from foundations, one being Deaconess, and I think one being another one. I don't remember what that other one was. And then a lot of one-on-one conversations. We were mentioned as one in an incredibly long list of places to donate in a Rolling Stone article that got us about a total of $30,000. So this is sort of how we built out this network to get $386,000. Again, with only 50,000 of it coming from a foundation. I didn't include it in here, but I have worked with, I don't work at a nonprofit, but I've worked with a couple nonprofits, and oftentimes they're 80 to, at the low end, maybe 60% foundation based in terms of what their operating budget looks like, with then the next iteration being major donors, so people who give sort of large grants and have individual relationships with, quote, major gift officers. And then the rest would be individual donations, group donations, being paid for their work, etc. Even groups that are sort of very grassroots funded and sort of go about being very grassroots funded do not have the majority of their support coming from the grassroots. At the nonprofit level, at the national level, etc., and especially at local levels. So it was super cool that we could raise this much money from us reaching out to folks we know, and then them reaching out to folks we know, and then being mentioned for the work that mutual aid was doing in a couple of local news, like we were mentioned twice in local news and once in national news, and that was it. Yeah, so the first spreadsheet, the first iteration raised about $20,000, and then the rest is from everything else. So $20,000 is in direct financial solidarity that was then reported to our website, which is someone seeing a need, directly Venmoing, Cash Apping, et cetera, them, and then telling us that they did so. Then 345,000 was directly donated to the fund, and the fund then dispersed out to folks. Originally, we were prioritizing pushing people towards direct financial solidarity, and then at some point, because we had the capacity to get people cash or to get people checks, or to, particularly in the instance of TEP Mission STL, just get people money, that direct financial solidarity wouldn't necessarily have been able to do, like through Venmo or Cash App, or give direct money towards folks who speak Spanish predominantly or only Spanish, more so than the average donor was able to. We sort of allowed it to shift more towards the financial solidarity fund. The average donation is about $100. That is based on the spreadsheet. Yes, so that doesn't include everybody, and that's a little of a misstated thing. And then we got over 1,400 donations, which is super great, and that's a very wide berth of people to care and invest, etc. And I will say, like, I know that this is the financial solidarity webinar, and there are so many other ways that people have contributed that are not financial solidarity. And so, like, the list of like how much we have done and how much we have raised and how many people are in this network is so much bigger. But I'm focusing specifically on financial solidarity for this like webinar. Other people are doing a bunch of cool stuff. So we use a combination of all of the apps that people use to transfer money and DonorBox. So if you go to DonorBox and you create a reoccurring donation on our website, that is sort of that amount of data. So we have a little over 100,000 from one-time donations and a little over 50,000 from reoccurring donations. I think we have about 30 reoccurring donors, if I'm not mistaken. And any nonprofit, anyone who fundraises, any campaign, etc., is going to tell you that they prefer reoccurring donations to one-time donations, partially because you can plan to sort of say like, okay, we will meet this number by this amount if all of the reoccurring donors stay reoccurring donors, and partially because oftentimes if you're giving a one-time donation, it's how much you can give in that moment, whereas if you're giving a reoccurring donation, that money is sort of spread out and oftentimes a bigger commitment than what a one-time donation would be. So I don't know if we necessarily pushed people or asked of people to do one-time versus reoccurring, but the numbers are interesting in terms of about a third of our donations through DonorBox specifically are reoccurring, but most of them have been one-time, which also, as like someone in this group, is sort of, we're shifting towards challenging the quantity over quality. And so having more specific relationships with folks to where we have a deeper relationship, which either looks like a reoccurring donor or having a one-time donation when people can, but that's a relationship-based thing rather than you saw us in a newspaper, you saw an Instagram post, or you thought this thing was cool. We're more interested in the folks who are already a part of this community and bringing the folks who are not necessarily a part of this community but are quote donors into the community, to where they don't just have this sort of title of donor, that they're actually aware of everything that's going on and have relationships with the things that they're most interested in doing, right? Everybody doesn't have to do everything, but partially as an acknowledgement that there is a ton of wealth in St. Louis, and that wealth and the charity like umbrella in St. Louis doesn't actually get to folks in a lot of ways, right? There was the Post-Dispatch article about a woman who donated millions and millions of dollars to the opera, which is wonderful if you enjoy opera. And there's a ton of folks who could have like been able to stay in their apartments or been able to get food, etc. With that $83 million that she gave to the opera. So part of that is also just like being clear with folks about what they can give and what is a comfortable and a meaningful amount to them. So the other part of this is that like donors are not more or less important based on how much they give. If they give what is meaningful to them, and that's either in time or donations or being a part of this community or being a part of St. Louis in other ways, that's awesome. And there are white wealthy folks to where they can give what is meaningful for them, and that's requires a bit of pushing because of capitalism and white supremacy. So yeah, before I go on to the one-on-one conversations, do folks have questions or thoughts about all of that? I'll go back to here. Cool. Okay, if you do have questions, feel free to put them in the chat or poke me in the face from afar.
Sorry, I realized I do have a question. I apologize.
Yeah, go for it. No, you're good.
Yeah, so thinking about like one-time versus recurring donations, I am the kind of person who would like probably be able to do, I would consider, my default would be to do a one-time donation based on the amount of money I have available at any given time, kind of thing, sort of like how you put. But if organizations would prefer recurring donations, do you know of like a meaningful way to sort of calculate what an appropriate amount would be to do as a recurring? Because it feels, I don't know, I could see myself feeling cheap by doing like, oh, well, I'll give $25 a month for the whole year, but I technically have like that, I'm bad at math, like $400? That's $400 today. So I could give you $400 today, and that like feels like it's going to go farther than $400 in the next year. Do you know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, totally.
Okay.
I think one of the things that we talked about, and like one of the things that we talk about as a group, is not just asking of other people, but also sharing what we're doing. So a lot of the folks on the financial solidarity team, myself included, tried to look at this through percentage. So I committed, I don't remember what the exact percentage was. And then also my salary got cut, so the percentage changed with the amount didn't. But at one point I was giving, I think 15% of my monthly income to mutual aid.
Okay.
And that was just like, I built that into what my budget looks like. And so I might have $400 now, but my sense was that like building it into my budget and also giving what I can in the moment, in a way that like was sustainable, but also meaningful, and like an awareness of how much flexibility I had as someone who still had a job and was still paid enough that I can like very much live comfortably, is part of what that is. And I don't think necessarily that like our goal is to tell people like you have to, like there's a version of this where a major gifts officer or someone at a nonprofit says like, can you commit to 200 a month? Can you commit to 100 a month? Where you start with the biggest ask and you work your way down, and then people draw their lines wherever they do. And I think that there is some value in that, but I think that that's really stressful, especially if you just keep saying like, I can't do that, I can't do that, I can't do that, and keep having to like categorize yourself in that way. So we've been saying like a percentage, and this is something that we got from Resource Generation, a certain percentage of your income to just set aside and be a part of mutual aid. And if your income isn't like, that also disproportionately affects people with lower incomes, to where like a higher percentage with a lower income affects you more than if you have a high income and you're still doing that percentage, but you have the flexibility to live with all this stuff. So it's definitely about flex, like it's definitely all complicated, and for us mostly was had on a one-on-one conversation basis.
That's really helpful. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem. I will say nonprofits will say like, do both. Yeah, if people have questions, put them in the chat or just go off mute and start talking. So this is actually a big part of what the next slide was, which is conversations. So some folks, like everyone has a different level of comfortability with conversations about money, particularly like the people who are wealthy don't have conversations about money and aren't willing to be explicit about money and are sort of like, you have to like doing a dance about it. Whereas folks like that isn't necessarily everyone's experience of talking about money. And it's like it's a very much individual thing. So we sort of on the website, we have a guide with some draft text messages or some draft emails. I think most of the info is still up to date. And so I can also link that or send that to Danielle to send out with the recording of this. But part of it is like that it is more about a conversation than a specific outline. And the more personal and the more specific the conversation is, the better any type of relationship is, but also the better a conversation about money within capitalism is. So we set a couple of guidelines for ourselves mostly, which is one, the number one reason donors give is because someone asked them. So this ties into number two, but basically like just keep asking folks and keep bringing it up, and which brings into number two, don't say no for people. So this happened to me a couple of times. This happened to other people that like, I would be like, I know what that person's job is. I know that they are making less money than I am. So I'm not going to ask them for a donation. And then in one way, and that's super paternalist and that's super based in white supremacy culture in a lot of ways. And so then they figured out about mutual aid and donated anyway. And I realized that it was not my role to tell people that they like to choose who has access to this or to gatekeep who is a part of this, especially if the conversations are inclusive, responsive, and not raising up wealth to a like hierarchy. So yeah,
I was just gonna say, one of the things that I do a lot with my friends is I just drop mutual aid a lot. Not that they've donated or anything, but with some of my friends who I just say, oh, I have to work on I'm working on mutual aid stuff, or I went and did a mutual aid drop, or I'm grocery shopping for mutual aid. And eventually they were just like, okay, you keep talking about this mutual aid thing, like we should know what you're talking about. And it like generated interest on their end without me having to be like, I'm doing this thing called mutual aid. But they were just like, you've been talking about this a lot, and now I want to know why you keep saying this, like I should know what you're talking about, because now I want to know what you're talking about. So that's one thing that I found. If I just keep dropping it, people eventually ask me about it.
Yeah, I also talk about it a lot. If you all can't tell, I also talk fast. So please poke me if I'm speaking too quickly. I come from a family that talks really fast a lot. Yeah, I mean, that's totally it. And that also asking someone to contribute or asking someone to be a part of mutual aid is not an imposition, because mutual aid has, like, I've gotten so much from mutual aid, both in relationships, in learning stuff, in being able to exist outside of my apartment, in creating community, etc. And so asking someone to be a part of mutual aid in whatever way they can, be it financial or in time or in capacity or in like, if they know how to do some really cool stuff that none of us know how to do, those are all like valuable and important things. And so, yeah, I think sometimes we think of gatekeepers as like really bad things and mostly people with power, but also I think it's about information and it's about relationships, etc. So that gets into number 3, which is exactly what Danielle said, which is speak from your experience about mutual aid. Like, we're all in it because we care about it and have gotten things from it. And a lot of us have reasons for being in mutual aid or caring about mutual aid. And so talking about that is a fantastic reason to communicate why it's an important thing or why it matters to you or why you really like the work that it's doing, etc. The more personal, the better. I'm positive that I'm not the only one who's gotten fundraising emails from someone or another who says like, thanks, we want money, click here, donate. like either from a political campaign or a nonprofit, et cetera. And if like at some point I don't open them because I know what they're going to be and I know that they're not actually about me. But if a friend reaches out, like that's a lot, I'm much more likely to respond and interact with that because there's a relationship under it. And then one thing that we did, and I think should do again in some ways, or like was super helpful for us, was at the end of each of our calls, we set a goal and had an accountability buddy. And we're like, okay, I will reach out to this many people. And sometimes we even said like, okay, write down a list, like what those people are. Accountability is super fun. Accountability is super helpful. Yay for accountability, or accountability buddies. And then I included like what a lot of our posts were, which is hi, introduction, intro to mutual aid, specific experience, the ask. So the specific experience is for a lot of folks was I'm giving this amount, or I'm giving this percentage, or I've been given for this period of time. Can you join me, or would this be something you're interested in, et cetera? And then offer for support and follow-up. Yeah, that's pretty self-explanatory. And that, like, we have, as I mentioned, examples in text and Facebook conversations and stuff. And I think one thing that I've gotten from this being in the financial solidarity team is like, I am less scared of asking people for money than I was in the first place. And I will say we also have reached out to people who are receiving money to either get their feedback or to get their address to send them a check, or et cetera. And so those conversations have also been something I've really enjoyed being able to have, and learning more about folks' lives and having relationships with them. And I will end by saying St. Louis's Mutual Aid's reading group is incredibly relevant to this, because we're reading a book called The Revolution Will Not Be Funded, which is about the nonprofit industrial complex and how, I mean, it doesn't have one thesis, but it's how do we exist beyond or within or around or surrounded by or in the context of the nonprofit industrial complex. And by way of that, capitalism and dealing with money and trying to do change that we believe in. If folks have questions, I'll stop talking now.
What's next for the mutual aid fund?
I don't know. Just like what's next for mutual aid, we are deferring that decision to impacted folks, to folks of color. And so I think, I think the financial solidarity team is down to implement what mutual aid decides. And some of us have opinions and perspectives, but we don't know.
That was going to kind of be my follow-up with the email that Julia sent today, which was everybody who has made a request has received the minimum. Is the plan then to reopen the requests or to continue along the path and to see what the next steps will be before that reopens, I guess?
Yeah, so I know that the financial solidarity team does not want to reopen it without, like, unilaterally, like our group of people who meet on Saturdays does not feel like we are the ones to make that decision, and so we're holding off until a decision or a sense or a consensus is reached, which is to say we don't know. I know there's a lot of like ideas and options and perspectives. One of the things about just opening it up means that whoever's immediately checking our website at the time will be able to, or will respond, which is fantastic. But also there is so much, like with unemployment, $600 extra ending, with the eviction moratorium ending, with long-term support for folks trickling down, the amount of the number of folks in the city who are going to need support is incredible. And that is because of systemic problems, not because of mutual aid. And we want to be intentional about who we're prioritizing and how we're supporting folks.
You're still raising money though.
The reoccurring donors we're still doing, we're still having one-on-ones. Part of what we're doing now is communicating to donors to get them involved in the rest of mutual aid. And so they're not just sort of doing that, but they know and have a better sense of the community and the network. So we're doing like text, like we're texting people and they're signing up for a one-on-one with one of us. But we're not doing necessarily like big pushes or big asks for money until we have a sense of what's going to happen.
So this is kind of a question like just more about finances and mutual aid sort of altogether. So there are folks with like outstanding financial need. I think there always will be in all of the pods, but there's someone that I was working with, and I know that there's someone who had offered to support neighbors with financial solidarity. And I wasn't sure if I should direct them to like give money directly to mutual aid or just pair them with that person who I know could use the funds sort of urgently, and just like what the best route of action is there, if you know people with needs and you know people with money, or if it should all be routed through kind of like a central location, or what that looks like.
So my sense is that if you can pair folks, go ahead and do it. Partially because the fund is currently pretty empty, but going to not be giving out money until a decision is made. And I know I can speak for our pod. There are folks who have reoccurring needs and we've supported them as a pod rather than directing them, because there isn't necessarily a place to direct them right now. I only took up 10 extra minutes.
I mean, in all fairness, we really didn't start until like 2:23-ish. So I'm going to count it as like 2 minutes rather than 10 minutes. So
Thanks.
I'm playing with the data a little bit. So yeah, if anybody has any additional questions for Sarah, Sarah, I don't know if you want to just pop your email in the chat. And we really appreciate you speaking on the Solidarity Fund. And it was great to get that email from Julia to hear kind of an update on it, because I feel like we haven't really chatted about the Solidarity Fund in about a month or so since we really kind of closed down the applications for it. So it was great to hear that like it's still going, even if it's not like in the forefront anymore because it's not accepting applications anymore. So thank you. All right. So next items, couple things that Julia wanted me to check in with folks is while she will be back next Wednesday to facilitate, she has mentioned that, and I also agree that this has worked out really nicely to have different facilitators each week, mainly because I was like, how is Julia handling this all on her own and has a job and hopefully a life of some sort. So she just sent out a request if anybody is interested in taking some of the August facilitations. That would be great. So I don't know, I just want to get a judgment of, or not a judgment, but if anybody is feeling called at this moment to facilitate one of the August Wednesdays, just drop a line in the group chat and I'll pass that along to Julia. Drop a line with the Wednesday that you could facilitate and I'll pass that along to her. So she wanted me to ask about that. Awesome. Everyone's able at 8:05. Okay, cool. And the other, another thing she wanted me to ask is, Sarah was the last of the kind of like planned out Skillshares. So do we have, oh yeah, thanks Sarah. I always forget that part.